Hey guys, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how you can create fur texture in charcoal and just give you some tips and techniques that you can use to make your drawings look more realistic when working with this medium. I'm Kirsty Rebecca and I make drawing and painting tutorials that are easy to follow even if you're just starting out. If you want to follow along with a full-length, real-time version of this tutorial where I talk you through every step of the process, then there's a link to my Patreon channel in the description below. So one of my favorite techniques to use when working with charcoal is to actually use charcoal powder. So if you don't have charcoal powder, you can actually just make your own by rubbing a charcoal stick or some charcoal pencil on a piece of paper to the side, and then you can just apply that to your drawing using a brush. I found that by applying charcoal powder, you can actually get a really smooth result instead of using pencil to try and create that smoothness. And it's also a lot quicker than trying to create a really light layer with pencils. I like to apply the charcoal with a brush for lighter values, or if you want really dark areas, you can also use some sponges like the Soft Tools, that's SOFT, because it picks up a little more of that charcoal powder and lays it down a little bit darker. But for the majority of my drawings, I like to just go in with a really soft sort of makeup brush or a soft watercolor brush. And a good tip, if you actually do buy charcoal powder, when you go to open it for the first time, make sure that you open the container over a sink, because I've done this numerous times where I've opened my container over my artwork and the powder just goes everywhere. So make sure that you open the container over a sink and then just tip a small amount into a really small container, and then actually put that small container inside a slightly bigger container. And that may sound excessive, but I found that really helps keep your work surface clean and just contains that charcoal powder a little bit better and avoids some of that mess. Another tip that may sound really obvious when you're working in charcoal is to turn your reference photo into black and white. It's much easier to draw from a reference photo that's in black and white when you're working with a black and white medium rather than trying to convert those values in your head. So just make it a little bit easier for yourself and turn your reference photo to black and white as well. I also usually adjust the contrast as well. So I make the highlights brighter and the shadows darker because I find that hyping up that contrast really helps make the drawing pop a little more. Make sure that you choose a good quality paper with enough texture. So try not to choose one that's really super smooth like the Strathmore Bristol Smooth or other really smooth papers like that. I'm actually using a Daler Rowney smooth heavyweight paper, but I've also used smooth watercolor papers, Clairefontaine Pastelmat, and other drawing papers as well. So there are lots of different options, but you just don't want to use one that's super smooth because you want to have a little bit of texture for the charcoal to grip onto so you can add a few layers. So one of my favorite techniques to use with charcoal, especially for creating fur texture, is to actually use an eraser to sort of draw in the highlights. So I like to apply a light layer of charcoal powder with a brush, and then I come through with a really small eraser to lift up the charcoal to create some of that fur texture rather than trying to draw around all of the light bits of fur. So the eraser that I like to use is the Tombow Mono eraser. It's kind of like a mechanical pencil, but instead of the lead, it's got an eraser inside. And if you don't have one of these, you can actually just cut a sliver off of any eraser and just use the edge of that. And then once you've come through and lifted up some of the charcoal to create some of that texture, you can then come back through with your pencils on top to create more fur detail. When you're working on animals that have fur, to make a more realistic effect, you want to make sure that you're working in light layers, especially the first few layers. You don't want to fill up the tooth of the paper too quickly. And by the tooth, we just sort of mean the grain of the paper. So every paper that you work on has sort of like hills and valleys. And when your pigment comes across the top, it catches on the hills and then deposits in the valleys. And then once your valleys are filled up, it creates sort of like a level, slick surface where your pencil just won't grip onto the paper anymore and you won't be able to add any more layers. So by working in light layers, you'll make sure that you still have enough of that tooth for your following layers to be able to build up that fur texture. And when it comes to the actual brand of charcoal, to me, it doesn't really matter too much which brand I use because most charcoal and graphite in general are light fast, so they're usually archival and they'll last a really long time. Some of the brands that I've used are Derwent, Faber-Castell, and Generals, and I think they're all pretty decent. When you're working on fur texture, you want to make sure that your pencil strokes are going in the right direction. You also want to make sure that they're the right length as well. So you really want to pay attention to your reference photo quite closely, because areas like around the eyes and the nose, especially on subjects like this where it's quite wrinkled, the fur tends to change directions quite quickly. So you don't want to do all your fur going the exact same direction over the entire piece, because that's not going to look realistic. You want to look at each section of your reference photo separately and look at the direction of the fur and how long it is and when it changes. Because you don't want to put really long pencil strokes in areas where there's short fur, because it's going to make it look like it has long fur there, and vice versa. So make sure that it's the right length and the right direction, but you also still want to vary your strokes slightly. So you want some to start and stop at different points or curve slightly differently. You don't want them to all line up exactly the same, like it's been combed flat or like it's lining up like a picket fence. You want them to be slightly different so that it looks a little bit more realistic. And when you're creating your fur with your pencil strokes, try not to scribble back and forth in a start and stop motion, because those sort of corners or start and stop points when you change direction can look quite harsh and unrealistic. Instead, make sure that you lift up your pencil for each stroke. Before I share my next tip, if you'd like to improve your drawing and painting skills even further, then my Patreon channel is the solution for you. From as little as $4 per month, you will have access to every tutorial that I've previously uploaded on your chosen tier level in a variety of mediums like pastel, colored pencil, charcoal, watercolor, and more. There are tutorials available for a range of subjects like wildlife, birds, landscapes, still life, flowers, and portraits. If you would like to view the entire Patreon tutorial library before joining us, I'll also leave that link in the description for you as well. Not only are my tutorials full length, real time, and fully narrated with clear instructions and explanations, but you will also have access to the original reference photo, a traceable outline, and a list of suppliers including the exact color names I'm using, so you really can relax and follow along every step of the way. Every month, I upload brand new tutorials to the Patreon library, so you can grow and develop your drawing and painting skills and take your art to the next level. You can also join in on our members chat group, where you can ask questions or advice, or share your artwork, and you can talk to other members in the Patreon community. And the best part is that there are no lock-in contracts, so you can upgrade or downgrade to a different tier level, or you can cancel your pledge at any time if Patreon isn't right for you. So why not give it a go? The link is in the description if you want to check it out. Another tool that I really like to use with charcoal are blending stumps. And if you've watched my pastel tutorials, you probably would have heard me talk about just using cotton tips to blend, but I like using blending stumps specifically for charcoal, because when you blend out with the blending stumps, eventually you end up with excess charcoal covering the blending stump, and you can actually use that to apply to lighter areas to create smoother textures and things like that by actually using the blending stump itself without going in with a lot of charcoal from your pencil or a stick or the powder. And I find that the blending stumps work really well to actually blend out the charcoal itself. So I tend to work in layers, and I usually blend out each layer as I go, because it makes it look a little bit softer and just blends away the pencil strokes a little bit. And it also pushes the charcoal into the tooth of the paper slightly, which allows you to add a few more layers as well. So you can see that I'm resting my hand on top of a sheet of glassine or tracing paper, and that's just to stop the charcoal from lifting up off my piece onto my hand or from my hand smudging the actual artwork itself. You don't have to use a piece of glassine or tracing paper, you can actually just use any paper, but I recommend resting your hand on a piece of paper or some glassine or tracing paper instead of actually resting on your artwork itself. So the way that I like to work, especially on animals with fur, is to work in layers instead of sections. So you'll find that some people tend to work on a certain section at a time, like they'll start with the ear and then they'll complete that fully and then move on to the next section. Whereas I find that working in layers is a little bit easier for me, because if I work in sections like that, I find that my work looks disjointed and not really cohesive because the strokes don't end up matching up, or the values are slightly different, so my shadows and my highlights are slightly different, or just has a different sort of texture about each section where it stopped and started into the next section. So I find that by working in really light layers and just building up my entire piece as I go along, I can build up those dark shadows and bright highlights all evenly across the piece, so that way I can judge how light I need to go and how dark I need to go with the other areas of the piece. But it's totally up to you how you want to work. Whatever you find easier, you can do that. When it comes to actually doing your initial outline, I always recommend that if you want to freehand your outline or use the grid method, then do it on a separate piece of printer paper or cheaper paper first, and then transfer your outline onto your drawing surface from there. And the reason for that is because if you draw with graphite, sometimes it can leave a graphite shine that the charcoal doesn't really stick to very well. And depending on the paper that you're working on, the lines may not erase fully, or you may damage your paper by erasing on it. So I recommend doing it on a separate piece of paper so you don't damage your actual working surface. And then once you've got your initial sketch ready on a separate piece of paper, or if you want to, you can print out your reference photo to the same size as your artwork, and then you can transfer your outline to your drawing surface by using a non-graphite based transfer paper. Or if you don't have that, you can actually just rub some charcoal on the back of your drawing or your printed reference photo and then place it over the top of your drawing surface and trace over your outline, and then the charcoal from the back of your outline will then imprint onto your surface. So that way you're actually starting out with an outline that is charcoal based, and it will blend into your following layers and won't cause any issues to your paper. So personally, when I'm working on fur texture, I'm trying to look at the clumps and clusters of fur rather than trying to draw every single individual strand of fur, because I find that if you try and draw every strand, it can tend to look quite wiry and almost like the fur is thicker than it looks in real life. It just doesn't look very natural that way. But if you try and draw the fur in clumps and clusters and just give a little bit of definition of the fur detail without doing every strand, it can actually look a lot more realistic when you're looking at it from a normal viewing distance. So basically what I'm saying is that super fine details are not really that necessary when you're drawing fur details. If you step back from your piece and look at it from a normal distance and you can't see the detail that you're adding, then it probably doesn't really need to be there. What's more important than the amount of detail is actually your values, so making sure that your shadows are dark enough and your highlights are light enough. That's more important than getting as much detail as you possibly can. And if you're not sure if your values are right, you can actually just take a photo of your artwork and compare it side by side on a computer or on your phone to your reference photo. And having them side by side like that and just looking back and forth between the two, you're more likely to see any areas that need to be slightly darker or lighter in comparison to your reference photo, and then you can just make that adjustment on your artwork from there. Another good tip when you're working with charcoal, if you get to the end and your highlights aren't as bright as you wanted them to be, like if you got charcoal in certain areas that were supposed to be white and your eraser just isn't lifting them up as much as you'd want it to, and then you can actually use a white charcoal pencil. I didn't use one for this piece, but I have used it in the past for other pieces where I've had this problem. So when you get to the end and you really want some finer lines or some crisp highlights, and then you can actually use that white charcoal pencil to help out there. It doesn't get as white as the white of the paper, but it can definitely help create some of those highlights if you need it. If you want to follow along with a full-length real-time tutorial of this guy, and then the link to my Patreon channel is in the description below. Otherwise, there's a playlist on the screen of some other charcoal tutorials that I thought you might find useful, so click on that and I'll see you over there.